Hello. Today I'm going to make a short demonstration of the Marudai, which is a Japanese braiding stand. It's circular, and I'll demonstrate a couple of different kinds of braids on it, as well as I'll start with telling you a few things about the Marudai. It is a short stand. You can buy them with longer legs, but actually the shorter legs are the most versatile. I often like to stand when I braid, and this is a perfect height. You never want your shoulders or your arms up too high. You don't want to have it so low that you're leaning over it. So I find at table height, this Marudai with the short legs works beautifully for standing, and that's my preferred way. I can also put it on a milk crate and sit in a chair. And lastly, the traditional Japanese way with the short legs is that you would kneel on the floor with the Marudai a little bit between your knees. So you would be kneeling with your legs out a little bit, and you could braid that way. That's my least favorite. So let's take a close look at this Marudai. As most things that are Japanese, it is beautifully made. I prefer the kind with 4 legs. And I do believe 4 legs are traditional, though for several years, in the beginning of this popularity in the US and in Europe, you could buy them with 3 legs. But in a short while, 4 legs will become obvious why I prefer it. And let's take a close look at the top of the Marudai. The rest of the Marudai has a light finish on it, but this round disc at the top does not. And I think that is because, with the oils from your hands, eventually it develops a very durable finish that would not be the case if it had been finished with anything like a wax or a hard turpentine oil type finish, or even a shellac or a varnish. That would not be a good finish for it after years of use. I want you to notice, it looks like it might be a simple thing that you could make yourself or get a woodworking friend to make yourself. In many ways it is very simple, but this angling down, this curving towards the center hole is actually something that would require quite a bit of woodworking skill, not for a beginner. And it also requires a tool that many woodworkers would not have. And before they used it, to make something like this, you would want to have some practice with that tool, which I believe is called a shaper. So let's look at the items that I already have attached, which I'll call my warp. I have 16 groups of strands of silk. And if I do that, I hope you can see that there's multiple strands of very fine silk on each of my bobbins, which are called tama. And all of my tama for this braid weigh the same amount. And that's another detail about Japanese braiding, is that you need to use good tama that do weigh exactly the same amount, very consistent. These happen to weigh 85 grams. The standard weights of Japanese tama are 70 grams, 85 grams, and 100 grams. I have 16 parts of my braid. Let's call it 16 elements. I'm facing the front of my takadai, and I hope you can see the difference in my colors. I have sort of a dark red verging on burgundy at north and south, and east and west. And when I'm setting up my Marudai, I do think about directional orientation. I am thinking north, south, east, west. But when I'm braiding, I don't give that a thought anymore. So here I have a different color, 4 sets of a different color of braid. And that's here's where my directions get crazy, northwest, southeast, and northeast, southwest. So basically, I have divided the top of my Marudai into eighths. And it's sort of shaped, if you thought about each one as one element, it would be like cutting a pizza into 8 wedges. There's 2 elements of the braid at every directional place on my little compass here. I'm going to demonstrate a round braid and then a flat braid in a moment. Right now I want to tell you just a few more things about the Marudai, which is, with this unfinished Marudai top, the Japanese consider this a mirror, and they call this the mirror of your braiding. When I look down into it, I've just pulled out a chopstick which was holding things in place. I can describe that in a moment. I can see the orientation of my braid. Can you come up and look? That is the point of braiding. And eventually you'll get used to seeing what particular braids look like at their point of braiding. What I'll tell you for now is you can see that the lighter corally pink elements of my braid are sitting at the highest level of things that have been interlaced. That means I finished on the lighter colored reds, and my next move will be with the darker reds. Every movement on the Marudai for making a braid is very symmetrical. For every yin, there's a yang. It might be that you do 2 yins and then 2 yangs, but it's a very balanced movement that you're always making. And for round braids, things tend to go clockwise and then counterclockwise and then clockwise again and counterclockwise for any number of movements, because every braid, to create the design, has different movements. To make a flat braid, your movements will be different. You want a flat interlacement. So what tends to happen is your braids would be more like this. Some quadrant of the northern hemisphere and some quadrant of the southern hemisphere, and your movements will be north and south only, and they will balance. And then when you get to the final elements that are your outer edges, you might just switch them, which will close that edge of your flat braid. Square braids involve moving north-south, a number of movements, and east-west. And again, it will all balance. That's what's so relaxing about working on a Marudai. And I want to make sure all my bobbins, when I start, are about equal height. There's a wonderful slip knot I have used. So I wind on the bobbin and I make a lark's head, which you can see here, I think. And then it slides down, and what that allows me to do is lower them when I need them lowered. They just slip on that knot and then they tighten. I'll lower these, and then maybe we'll do a round braid. Throughout the braiding, you want to keep your tama at the same height with each other. It can get shorter. The longer you braid, they will get shorter, and you'll have to lengthen them, but most of the time they need to be the same height, even if they're getting shorter. Okay, let's take a quick look under the Marudai, but first, when I'm not braiding, when I'm going to walk away for a while, I pull down on the braid. Look in the center, see I'm pulling down, and I insert a chopstick through half of the elements. There we go, and that holds it. I have 16 bobbins or tama, and that creates quite a lot of weight. They're each 85, so I have 85 times 16 grams hanging from this braid. And I would not be able to braid it if I didn't have a bag of counterweights and these little extra counterweights to balance the braid. That's what keeps it staying with the braiding point a little below the hole in the center. And as I braid, the braid comes down through the center, and that means the whole thing's lowering. You can see I've got quite a lot of braid here of things I was practicing from a class. And as this bag lowers itself and is almost touching the bottom of the Marudai, I have to pull it all up again so that once it touches, there will be no counterweight action to hold the braid in place. So we're all set. I've got my counterweight pretty much to the top of the braid where it's hanging. And I'll pull out my chopstick. If you don't, you'll be braiding around a chopstick. And the first round braid I'm going to show you is called Oimatsu Gumi. Gumi is a word you'll see at the end of every braid, and it means braid. Oimatsu happens to mean old pine, as in old pine tree. And it gives a very textured kind of interlacement. And it must have reminded someone who did this braid very early and decided to name it. It must have reminded them of the bark on a pine tree.